John lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood with his wife, Sarah, and their son, Jack. On the surface, their lives seemed ordinary: the neatly trimmed lawns, the white picket fence, the small house with flowers blooming by the porch. Yet, beneath the facade of suburban bliss, the reality of their home was far from peaceful. John, a man in his mid-40s, struggled with deep-seated demons. His addiction to alcohol and gambling had cast a dark shadow over his family's existence. At first, it had been the occasional drink, a beer after work, then a whiskey on weekends. But over time, these small indulgences had grown into something far more destructive. John found comfort in the numbing effects of alcohol. And when the money ran out, he turned to gambling to fill the void. It wasn't long before his vices consumed him entirely. Sarah, his wife, had always been a kind and loving woman. Her warm smile had once been the center of their small family. And her optimism had carried them through the early years of their marriage. But as the years passed, her smile grew less frequent. The joy she once radiated had been replaced by a quiet sadness. The result of the constant tension in their home. Every day was a battle to keep things normal, to hold on to whatever love remained between them. But John's inability to control his urges, the outbursts of rage that came without warning, and the cruel words he often directed at her had eroded the foundation of their family. John's behavior was erratic. Some nights, he would come home after a long day at work, already drunk, ready to pick a fight. Other times, he would disappear for days, lost in the world of gambling, leaving Sarah to manage everything. It was as though his addictions had taken control of his every action. And Sarah was left to pick up the pieces. There were times when he would become violent, his anger boiling over into physical outbursts. He would yell, push, and sometimes hit. It was a cycle that Sarah couldn't break. No matter how hard she tried, she felt trapped in a life she hadn't imagined. She wanted to leave, but where could she go? What would become of Jack? She stayed, clinging to the hope that things might one day change. But deep down, she knew the truth, that her family was unraveling, and the life they had once known was slipping away. Jack, their 10-year-old son, had grown accustomed to the constant tension in their home. He learned early on how to stay out of John's way when he was drunk, how to keep his head down when the shouting started. Jack was a quiet boy, introverted, and much like his mother, he wore a mask of calmness. Even though his world was far from calm, he loved his father, but he was also terrified of him. The unpredictability of John's behavior had created a fear in Jack that haunted him every day. Would today be a good day? Or would his father lose control again? The stress weighed heavily on him, his young heart torn between love for his father and a deep, gnawing fear that he couldn't escape. Through it all, the one constant source of comfort and protection was Max, the family's German shepherd. Max had been a part of the family for as long as Jack could remember. The dog had always been there, loyal, affectionate, and protective. He had been there through the quiet moments when Sarah would sit with Jack and try to reassure him. And he had been there during the darker moments, when John's rage had flared up. Max was Sarah's rock in many ways. He had an uncanny sense of when things were about to get worse. Whenever John started drinking heavily or when the tension in the house escalated, Max would be by Sarah's side, alert, watching over her and Jack. He would often place himself between John and Sarah, growling low in his throat as if to say, "Stay away from them." Max had saved them more than once. On nights when John was particularly angry, Max would place himself between the family and John, his massive frame a silent shield. He would bark and growl, warning John to stop, and more often than not, that would be enough to de-escalate the situation, at least temporarily. But Max wasn't just a protector, he was a friend, a companion to both Sarah and Jack. He provided the unconditional love and loyalty that they so desperately needed in a home filled with fear. When Sarah would sit on the couch after a long, stressful day, Max would curl up beside her, resting his head on her lap, offering comfort with just his presence. Jack would often find solace in the dog's company, his gentle eyes and soft fur offering a brief respite from the chaos of his home life. Despite all the love Max offered, the constant tension in the house weighed heavily on Sarah's heart. She often found herself wondering how long she could continue living this way. Could she keep pretending everything was fine for Jack's sake? Could she keep hoping that John would somehow change? That he would somehow snap out of his addiction and violent tendencies? She had tried everything. She had begged him to stop drinking. She had pleaded with him to stop gambling. She had even threatened to leave. But each time, John would promise to change, only to fall back into his old habits. As the years went by, Sarah began to realize that she couldn't keep living in fear. Jack needed a safe, stable environment to grow up in. He deserved a life free from the threat of violence, a life where he didn't have to walk on eggshells every day. She had to make a decision. She had to protect her son, even if it meant walking away from the man she had once loved. One evening, after yet another violent outburst from John, Sarah found herself standing in front of the door to the living room, her heart racing. Jack was in his room, locked away, and Max was standing beside her, his eyes fixed on her as if he could sense her resolve. She knew what she had to do. The life they had been living wasn't sustainable anymore. John's addictions had taken everything from her: her peace, her happiness, her sense of security, and it had taken a toll on Jack as well. She couldn't allow this cycle of pain to continue. With Max at her side, Sarah made the decision. She was going to leave. It wouldn't be easy, but she had to protect Jack, and she had to protect herself. The road ahead was uncertain, but Sarah knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let fear control her life any longer. With Max by her side, and Jack's future in her hands, Sarah finally stepped into the unknown, determined to break free from the life of restraint that had held them all captive for far too long. The quiet suburban life Sarah and Jack had tried to build was shattered when John made a reckless decision that would change everything. His addiction to gambling had led him down a dark path, one that he had promised his family he would leave behind. But promises were easy to make and hard to keep, especially when the temptation of a quick win was too great to resist. Desperate to feed his addiction, John turned to a group of loan sharks, people with no mercy and no concern for anyone but their own profit. He had gone to them without thinking of the consequences, without understanding the depth of the trap he was stepping into. They offered him money without hesitation. But there was always a price. The terms were steep. But in his haze of desperation and addiction, John ignored them. When the money ran out and his debts piled up higher than he could handle, the reality of the situation hit him like a cold slap. But by then, it was too late. John couldn't pay. He had no money left. And his addiction had drained him of whatever hope he had once held. Fearing the brutal repercussions of his debt, he fled. Without a word, he disappeared, abandoning Sarah and Jack to face the consequences of his actions. It was a cowardly escape, one that left his family vulnerable and alone. In the weeks that followed, the life Sarah and Jack had fought so hard to hold together became a waking nightmare. The loan sharks came for them. At first, it was just a few threatening phone calls. But soon it escalated. They began showing up at their house, unannounced and intimidating. Their faces were cold, and their demands were harsh. Sarah tried to explain that she had no idea where John was, that she had no part in his gambling debts. But the loan sharks didn't care. They only cared about the money they were owed. And now, they saw Sarah and Jack as the next best thing. The threats started small but grew more dangerous. One evening, a group of men stood on the doorstep, glaring at Sarah with cruel eyes. They made it clear that if John didn't come back to settle his debts, she and Jack would pay. The men pushed past her, barging into the house and throwing things around. Sarah was terrified, but she stood her ground, trying to protect Jack and keep him out of sight. Max, their loyal German shepherd, barked ferociously, his protective instincts kicking in. He was always the first line of defense. But even Max could sense the danger that was closing in. He stood between Sarah and the men, growling fiercely, but it was clear the threat was bigger than he could handle alone. The loan sharks didn't back down. They slapped Sarah, their forceful hands sending her crashing against the wall. Max lunged at them, teeth bared, but one of the men kicked the dog away, sending him sprawling to the floor. It was an act of cruelty that made Sarah's heart break for her beloved dog. Max was loyal to a fault. But in this situation, even his strength wasn't enough to protect him from the malicious forces at play. Days turned into weeks, and the harassment continued. The loan sharks would show up at the house at all hours, demanding payment. When Sarah couldn't offer anything, they resorted to more violent methods, breaking windows, threatening them with guns, and making it clear that if they didn't pay up soon, things would get much worse. Sarah tried to stay strong for Jack, but the constant fear, the unrelenting threats, were taking their toll. Every day felt like a battle for survival. Jack would often lock himself in his room, too afraid to even come out for dinner, terrified that the men would show up again. Sarah, desperate and at her breaking point, had no idea what to do. Her husband had abandoned them, leaving them to face a nightmare alone. She tried to contact the police, but they were no help. The loan sharks were known criminals, untouchable by the law, And Sarah's case was just another in a long line of unreported, overlooked incidents. She had no money to hire a lawyer. And with each passing day, her sense of safety and hope was slipping further away. They were trapped in a cycle of fear, unable to escape. Through it all, Max remained by their side. Though he was becoming more and more exhausted, the dog's once strong frame was now worn. His body bruised from the beatings he had received while trying to protect his family. Yet, Max never stopped guarding Sarah and Jack. Every time the loan sharks came, he would stand tall, his posture firm, his teeth bared, ready to defend him at all costs. But Sarah could see the toll it was taking on him. He was no longer the strong, vibrant dog who had once joyfully played with Jack in the yard. He was worn and tired, but still loyal, still fighting for the family he had come to love. Sarah couldn't bear to see Max suffer, but she knew that she couldn't keep going like this much longer. The pressure was becoming unbearable. She couldn't protect Jack from this violence forever. She needed to do something, anything, to end the nightmare that had become their life. The thought of leaving seemed impossible. Where would they go? How could they start over when the people chasing them were everywhere? And nowhere was safe. One night, after another round of threats and violence, Sarah sat on the floor of their living room, holding Max's head in her lap. Jack had fallen asleep in his room, unaware of the danger that still loomed outside their door. She stroked Max's fur, feeling the warmth of his body against her, and she realized that she couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't let Jack grow up in this fear. She couldn't let Max endure any more pain. She had to find a way to escape, no matter what it took. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She would leave. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know how she would protect Jack and Max from the loan sharks. But she knew they couldn't stay there any longer. The violence was escalating, and she could feel it in her bones that if she didn't act soon, something far worse might happen. With nothing but the clothes on their backs, a few belongings, and the love of a loyal dog, Sarah and Jack packed their things. They would disappear, start over somewhere far away from the loan sharks and the violence that had destroyed their lives. They didn't have a plan, but they had each other, and that was enough. They couldn't continue living in fear. With Max by their side, they would take the first step toward freedom. And no matter how difficult the journey, they would fight to rebuild their lives, free from the grip of terror that had defined their existence for far too long. It was a small glimmer of hope in the darkness, but it was a glimmer nonetheless. It was a night like many others in the house Sarah and Jack had come to dread. The darkened windows barely shielded them from the growing threat that hung over their home. Max, their faithful German shepherd, lay at Sarah's feet, alert as always, watching every movement, sensing the danger that had become a constant presence in their lives. The loan sharks had been tormenting them for weeks, demanding the money that John had borrowed but never returned. Tonight, like so many times before, they had come again, banging on the door, their presence felt before they even spoke. The knock was loud, insistent, and filled with menace. Sarah's heart sank as she stood up, trying to calm Jack, who had already retreated into the safety of his room. but still unable to shield himself from the fear that crept in around the edges. Sarah had tried so many times to get help, to call for someone to intervene. But no one had come. The police were useless. The loan sharks too powerful to be touched by the law. Tonight, she could feel the weight of her helplessness more than ever. When Sarah opened the door, she was greeted with a group of menacing faces. Their eyes cold and filled with anger. The loan sharks had grown more impatient with each passing day. And tonight, their fury was palpable. They pushed past her into the house, their feet heavy on the floorboards, their words laced with threats. "Where's the money, Sarah?" one of the men growled. "We're not here to wait any longer. I don't know where he is," Sarah pleaded, trying to hold back the rising panic. "John's gone. I can't pay." The men didn't care. Their eyes darted to the living room where Jack was hiding. And Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. They were there for blood. Not just money. They were going to make her pay for her husband's mistakes. Before Sarah could react, one of the men struck her, the force of the blow sending her stumbling back into the wall. Jack screamed from his room, but the sound of his mother's pain echoed louder in his ears. "Mom!" he cried, his voice filled with terror. The men laughed as Sarah tried to stand, her hand clutching her throbbing face. But she didn't have time to think about the pain, only about her son and the escalating violence in her home. She needed to protect Jack. She needed to get him out of there. But how could she? It was then that Max, their loyal German shepherd, finally made his move. Max had been watching the men carefully, his body tense and his instincts sharp. Sarah had always known that Max was more than just a dog. He was their protector, their guardian. And tonight, he would prove it once again. With a sudden, powerful bark, Max lunged at the group of men, his powerful body moving with speed and precision. He sank his teeth into the leg of one of the men, forcing him to stagger back in shock. The other men froze for a moment, surprised by the dog's sudden attack. But they quickly recovered. One of them pulled out a bat, swinging it at Max with full force. Max dodged, but not quickly enough. The bat collided with his side, sending him sprawling to the ground with a yelp of pain. Max wasn't deterred. His loyalty to Sarah and Jack burned bright, and he struggled to rise. His body battered but his spirit unbroken. He lunged again, this time at the man holding the bat, his teeth sinking into his arm. The man screamed in pain. But Max wouldn't stop. He fought with everything he had, trying to push the attackers back, trying to protect the family he loved. Sarah screamed for Max, but she couldn't move. She was terrified for him, for Jack, and for herself. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the scene unfold before her. She knew she had to act, but fear paralyzed her. The loan sharks, realizing they couldn't subdue Max so easily, began to back away, their eyes darting to the door. One of them raised a hand, signaling for the others to retreat. "This isn't over, Sarah," he spat. "We'll be back, and next time, you'll pay." With that, they turned and left, leaving the door swinging open behind them. But the damage had been done. Max was on the floor, his side heaving with the strain of his battle. Blood staining his fur where the bat had struck him. Sarah rushed to his side, her heart aching as she knelt down beside him. "Max, no," she whispered, her voice breaking. She gently stroked his head, tears welling in her eyes. He had given everything to protect them. And now he was hurt. But even as she looked at him, she saw his eyes, still full of determination and love. Max was not going to give up. Jack, hearing the commotion settle, cautiously stepped out of his room. When he saw Max lying on the floor, he ran to him, his small hands shaking as he gently petted the dog. "Max, please be okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah looked at her son, her heart breaking. He had witnessed the violence, the terror, but he also had witnessed Max's bravery. "Max is strong," Sarah said, her voice steady, though tears streamed down her face. "He's going to be okay. Jack, we have to get him help. We're going to be all right." But as she looked at her son, the weight of the situation hit her fully. They were safe for now. But the danger wasn't over. The loan sharks would return. And next time, they might not just take their anger out on her. Max had saved them, but Sarah knew that this wasn't the end. She had to make a choice: stay and wait for the inevitable, or leave and fight to protect her son, her dog, and herself from this nightmare. Her mind raced as she helped Max to his feet, supporting his weight as best as she could. The dog winced in pain, but he stood, his body shaking but strong. Sarah knew she couldn't do this alone anymore. She had to get out. She had to fight back. Max looked up at her, his eyes filled with loyalty and courage. He might be hurt, but his heart was still fighting. Sarah leaned down and whispered in his ear, "We're going to make it out. Max, you've given everything for us. Now it's our turn." With Jack by her side and Max still at her feet, Sarah made the decision. They would leave. No more running from the violence. No more hiding in fear. It was time to take control. To escape the life that had trapped them for so long. And with Max's bravery still fresh in her heart, Sarah knew they would face whatever came next together, no matter the cost. The night had left its mark on Sarah and Jack, a mark that no time could erase. As they rushed Max to the veterinary clinic, the pain of what had just transpired still felt like a heavy weight pressing down on their hearts. The sight of their loyal dog, battered and bruised from the brutal assault by the loan sharks, filled Sarah with a sorrow she could barely comprehend. Max had been their protector, their shield against the terror that had invaded their lives. Now, as the car sped toward the clinic, Sarah's mind was clouded with guilt and fear. Was it too late? Would Max survive? Max, despite the deep wounds he had sustained, remained by their side, his body trembling with each movement. Sarah could feel his warmth, his strength, but she knew it was fading. The brutal strike to his side, the relentless violence inflicted upon him, had taken its toll. And yet, through all of it, Max had never wavered in his devotion. He had fought for them, stood between them and the dangers that lurked outside. And now, in his final moments, he was still with them, still showing his love and loyalty. When they arrived at the clinic, The vet was quick to assess Max's condition. The wounds were severe, the blood loss too great. They had arrived too late. Max's body had endured more than it could handle, and there was nothing they could do to save him. Sarah sat by Max's side, her heart breaking as she stroked his fur, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. Jack stood beside her, his small hand clutching hers. His eyes filled with unshed tears. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could see the sadness in his mother's eyes, and he could feel the weight of the loss. The vet gave them a moment, stepping away to allow him to say their goodbyes. Sarah leaned down, her face close to Max's, her voice trembling. "Max," she whispered, her voice soft and broken. "You've been so brave. You've protected us, kept us safe, and now you can rest. You've done more than we could ever ask of you." Max's eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, met hers. There was a quiet understanding in his gaze, a look that seemed to say, "I've done my job, I've kept you safe, now it's time for me to go." His eyes were full of love, full of gratitude for the family he had given everything for. In that moment, Sarah could see it all, the bond they had shared, the countless nights Max had slept by her side, the way he had protected Jack when she couldn't. He had given him everything he had. And now, he was leaving them with a final gift, the promise of safety. The hope of a future free from the terror that had haunted them for so long. As the vet administered the injection, Sarah felt a part of herself die with Max. He had been more than just a dog. He had been family. He had been their protector, their friend, their constant. The thought of going on without him was almost too much to bear. But as Max's breathing slowed and his body relaxed, Sarah knew that he had done what he had set out to do. He had kept them safe, even at the cost of his own life. He had sacrificed everything for them, and in doing so, he had given him the strength to face what lay ahead. Jack's tears fell freely as he whispered to Max, "Thank you, buddy, we love you." His voice was small, the words barely audible, but they were filled with the innocence of a child who had just lost his closest companion. Max's death left a hole in their hearts that nothing could fill. But amidst the grief, there was also a sense of gratitude, a deep appreciation for the loyalty and love Max had shown them. Sarah knew that it was Max's sacrifice that had allowed him to survive, that had given him the strength to escape the violence that had consumed their lives. It was because of him that they were still here, still fighting for a future free from fear. As Sarah and Jack walked away from the clinic, their hearts heavy with loss, they couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve building within them. Max's sacrifice wasn't in vain. It had brought them one step closer to freedom. It had shown him the true meaning of loyalty, courage, and love. And while they would never forget the pain of losing him, they knew that his memory would live on in the strength they carried with them. Max had given him the courage to move forward, to rebuild their lives, and to fight for a future that was free from the terror that had threatened to tear them apart. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and Jack began to take the necessary steps to start over. They moved to a new town, far away from the loan sharks and the violence that had once ruled their lives. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the pain of their loss felt too much to bear. But they held on to the lessons Max had taught them. He had shown him that even in the darkest moments, there was a glimmer of hope. He had given his life to protect them, and now it was their turn to honor that sacrifice. Sarah found work at a local animal shelter, where she began to heal, both from the trauma of the past and from the loss of her beloved dog. She poured her heart into helping the animals, knowing that Max would have wanted her to keep fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Jack, too, began to heal, slowly opening his heart to the idea of a new life. A life where he didn't have to live in fear. The pain of losing Max would never completely fade. He had been their rock, their protector, and the love he had shown them was irreplaceable. But as time went on, Sarah and Jack began to see the truth in Max's final gift to them. His sacrifice had given him the strength to break free from the chains of fear and violence. It had shown him that even in the face of unimaginable hardship, there was always hope. Max's loyalty, bravery, and sacrifice had saved their lives. And in doing so, he had given him a chance at a better future. They would carry his memory with them always. And in his honor, they would live the life he had fought so hard to protect. The loss of Max left a wound in Sarah and Jack's hearts that would never fully heal. But they knew that they couldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. His loyalty, courage, and love had given him a second chance at life, a chance to escape the violence and the constant fear that had plagued them for so long. With Max gone, the family had to find the strength to move forward, to rebuild their lives from the ground up. Sarah knew that starting over would not be easy, but the one thing she had learned over the years was that she was capable of surviving. She had survived John's abuse, the constant threats from the loan sharks, and the pain of losing someone who had been her rock, Max. Now, she had to rebuild not just for herself, but for Jack. She couldn't let him carry the weight of the past with him any longer. He deserved a future free from fear. A future where he could grow up in a home filled with love and security. The first step was to seek help. Sarah reached out to organizations that supported victims of domestic violence. These organizations provided the guidance and support she so desperately needed, offering everything from legal assistance to counseling. It was through these organizations that Sarah and Jack found a safe place to begin again. They moved to a small town, far from the shadows of their old life. It was a fresh start, one that offered the promise of safety and peace. The transition wasn't easy. Sarah and Jack had lived in fear for so long that it took time to adjust to the quiet. The peace that now surrounded them. Jack struggled with the memories of what he had endured. The nights spent hiding in fear. The angry shouts of his father echoing in his mind. But with time, the trauma began to fade. And Jack began to laugh again. He started to make friends. And slowly but surely, he began to heal. He had always been a quiet child. But now, he was finding his voice in ways that made Sarah proud. Sarah, too, found solace in the new life they were building. She began to work at a local animal shelter, a place where she could pour her heart into helping animals that had been abandoned or mistreated. Much like her family had been. It was a job that brought her peace, allowing her to heal by helping others who were in need. Every day, she worked to give these animals the love and care they deserved. And in return, they gave her the strength to keep moving forward. The work wasn't always easy, but it felt right. It felt like a way to honor Max's memory by caring for those who needed love and protection the most. As Sarah and Jack settled into their new life, the memories of Max never left them. They kept his collar in a special place, a reminder of the dog who had given everything to protect them. They spoke about him often, sharing stories of his bravery, his unwavering loyalty, and his love. In every quiet moment, in every act of kindness, they felt Max's presence, as if he was still there, watching over them. His sacrifice had given him the courage to leave behind the life that had held them captive for so long. It had given him the strength to build a new life, one filled with hope and love. The road to healing was long, but Sarah knew that they were on the right path. She had found a support system in the new town, with friends who understood the struggles she had faced and were there to offer help whenever she needed it. Jack had found a sense of belonging, a sense of security he had never known before. Sarah had learned that no matter how difficult the past had been, the future still held promise. She had learned that, like Max had shown her, loyalty, love, and bravery were the things that mattered most. Those were the things that would help her and Jack face whatever challenges lay ahead. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sunset with Jack beside her and Max's collar resting in her lap, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Max had given him everything. He had fought for them, protected them, and loved them unconditionally. He had been more than a dog. He had been family. And while they missed him dearly, they knew that his legacy would live on in the life they were now building. Jack, who had been sitting quietly beside her, looked up and said, "Mom, I think Max would be happy we're safe now. He'd want us to be happy." Sarah smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I think you're right, Jack. He'd want us to be happy. He'd want us to be strong." They sat in silence, the cool evening breeze brushing against their skin, the weight of the past slowly lifting. In that moment, Sarah realized that Max's sacrifice had done more than just protect them. It had given him hope. It had shown him that no matter how dark the world seemed, there was always a light at the end of the tunnel. That light was love, and it was enough to guide them through the storm. As Sarah looked out at the horizon, she knew that they had a long road ahead of them. But they weren't walking it alone. They had each other, and they had the memory of Max's love and sacrifice to carry them forward. The future was uncertain, but with hope in their hearts and the strength of their bond, Sarah and Jack knew they could face whatever came next. They had been given a second chance, and they were going to make the most of it. The story of their past, the pain they had endured, would always be a part of them, but it was no longer the story that defined them. The story that was unfolding now was one of resilience, hope, and love, the story of a family rebuilding after the storm, finding peace in the wake of tragedy, and embracing the future with open arms. Max had shown them what true loyalty and love meant. His sacrifice was the catalyst that had allowed them to step into a new chapter of their lives, one filled with the promise of a better tomorrow. And in that promise, Sarah and Jack found the strength to move forward, forever carrying with him the memory of the dog who had saved them all.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.